Alaska flag and the Alaska flag song is just very, very special. When I went to school up here, we said the Pledge of Allegiance, sang the national anthem and that song every single morning. So I could sing it for you if you like. No. But we are going to be in Sitka today. If there's a pearl or a jewel in Alaska, it's Sitka. It's an absolutely beautiful place, and you're so fortunate because only about 35% of the cruise ships come to Sitka. And we're going to be docking, by the way, at a very lovely brand new port that's only been there for about 5 or 6 or maybe 8 years. And I don't know if Deborah told you, but there's an IMAX there to have several really good programs right there at the port. But you want to get into town and see it. But Sitka is on an island, Baranof Island, and it sits at the foot of Mount Edgecumbe, and it's a dormant volcano, and it's not very tall by Alaska standards. The last time it erupted was about 800 years ago. However, a few years ago on the 4th of July, on April Fool's Day, a bunch of kids went up there and threw some burning tires into this and got the town really excited on an April Fool's joke. But in Sitka, some things that you can see that you'll really enjoy. The walking is very easy. The bus will take us into town. There's no charge for that. But this is the original Pioneer home, and it was initially made free, but now it's not free, but it's very reasonable. There's certain qualifications you can get there. The man who was best man in our wedding lives in Sitka, and he told us last week when we were there, he said, "My name is on the list. I plan to spend my last days in the Pioneer home." If you've read Michener's book, he wrote it here. And I have another book that I really recommend. I'll tell you about it later. But let's talk about this land and how we got it. Truthfully, it's the most amazing, incredible story. The more you hear about it, the more you realize that it was an absolute impossibility that came to pass. Now, Alaska has had several flags, the Russian-American flag, the British flag, the American flag, and of course the Alaska flag. And I shared this in my first program, but the word was, "Go west, young man." But truthfully, going west was not how people got here. They initially came from the east to see what was going on here, to see what was here. Now, to tell this story, we have to get our minds out of the 21st century and back into the 16th and 17th and realize that transportation and travel was completely different then than it is now. So we call this the Age of Expeditions. And what happened in these expeditions, a country or a king or even sometimes a private individual would finance an expedition to go out someplace and discover something, and they may not ever get back. Some of them never got back, and it would be 3 or 4 years when they got back. So we have to kind of get our mind into that mindset. It's not instant news or instant information. I don't know what the news is sometimes, but regardless. So this began with Tsar Peter the Great from Russia, and he commissioned what he called the Kamchatka expedition in 1724. Now, he chose this particular individual to head it. His name was Vitus Bering, and we'll talk a lot about him today. He came from Denmark. He was a Danish sailor, but for some reason he got chosen, and he gets credit for discovering Alaska. But on the Kamchatka expedition, just to give you an idea, to come from Denmark all the way to the eastern section of Russia, it took him 4 years. So once it was commissioned, it took him 4 years to get there. And then that expedition was about 4 years itself. So about 8 years from the time he was chosen until he got back. And he really didn't discover anything except one interesting piece of information. He did not spot any land, but he came back with the determination that there was a sea between that part of Russia and North America. So that seems very, very basic, but it was big news at that time. So that was the Kamchatka expedition of 1724. Now, Vitus Bering, and he took along with him this fellow Cherkov, and we'll talk about Cherkov. Now, Tsar Peter the Great, again, he now commissioned in 1733 what he called the Great Northern Expedition. Now, I put a map on here to show you, and once again, if you can put your mind back, we don't have lovely cruisers like we have here. We don't have motorboats. We have sailboats, and yet they took these incredible journeys. The green there is Vitus Bering's first journey, and the red is the second one, and we'll talk about where all he went. It was really incredible, and these are the boats that he went in. I mean, really, really basic. He had two boats, the St. Peter and the St. Paul, and they were identical, and they left in 1733. Now, this was the big one. On June 14th, this was in that expedition, they left on June 14th, 1741. This is well documented. And Vitus Bering was the captain of the St. Peter, and Chirikov was the captain of the St. Paul. And on this trip, Bering died, and we'll talk about that later. But these two ships left together, and the idea was they were going to stay together and hopefully discover something and come back and report to the Tsar. However, they weren't very far away from Kamchatka when they got separated in fog, and they literally never saw each other again. Literally never. This is Chirikov, who led the St. Paul Peter, and he was also there. He was the captain of the St. Paul, They left at the same time. This guy returned to Russia in 1741 and initially took credit for discovering Alaska. But it wasn't, he did not receive the final credit because really Bering was the leader, and he went much, much further, as we will see soon. Now, Bering took this interesting individual on his boat, the St. Peter. His name was George Steller. George Steller was a German naturalist, botanist, and scientist. He was not a sailor. He was not a Russian, but he heard about this, and he really wanted to be a part of it. Now, George Steller was an interesting person. He had a very interesting personality. In fact, you may know someone like George Steller. George Steller seemed to always have the right answer, but he was always obnoxious about it. And people just didn't like him. And so this is how he looked. This is George Steller. And so he talked his way onto the trip, not as a sailor, but really as a guest. And he was very narcissistic. He discovered quite a few things, took copious journals, of which we're very grateful, but he liked to name things, and he liked to name things after himself. So here we go. We have the Steller Blue Jay. They're still there today. We have the Steller Snow Eagle. We have the Steller Eider. We have the Steller Sea Lion. And we have the extinct Steller Sea Cow, very much like the manatee. And we know that from George Steller's documents. Now, as they were sailing, and this is Vitus Bering on the St. Peter, they needed some fresh water. And they were in Alaska waters by now. They didn't really know where they were, but they were in Alaska waters. And they came across this very rustic, remote, foreboding island that they named Kayak Island. And so Bering said, we have to send some men ashore to get some fresh water. So once again, Steller, with his obnoxious personality, he literally, my mother used to say, threw a hissy fit to get on that boat. And actually, if he'd been a sailor, he could have been charged with mutiny. But because he was sort of a guest, they let him on, and he was on the island with them, not looking for water. This was July 20, about a month after they left. And once again, George Steller, they found some water, and George Steller, he wasn't interested in finding water. He was just trying to find new plants and animals and anything he could find. He told the people, he said, the water you have is brackish. You need to go further into the island. But they didn't like him. They didn't listen to him. But the truth is, the water was bad, and that wasn't a good thing. But when it got time to come back to the boat, to the St. Peter, George Steller said, I need more time. And he just, once again, was very belligerent about it. And finally, Bering said, you either come now or this will be your permanent home. And so he finally got back on the ship. Now, we don't see this on this cruise, and often when we go by in the Gulf of Alaska, we don't see it either. But they came across this amazing mountain called Mount St. Elias. Just take a look at it. It erupts right from the sea. Take a look. There it is. You see the peak sticking up there? That's Mount St. Elias, 18,000 feet. And sometimes you never even see it. And for many, many years, it was considered the tallest mountain in Alaska because it just literally erupts from the sea. So Vitus Bering named this after the patron saint of Russia, who was St. Elias at that time, and it still has that name today. Now, by the time they got down to Mount St. Elias, they were way down into Alaska territory, not too far from Glacier Bay, although they didn't get to Glacier Bay. But just take a look at some of these notations of where Vitus Bering got in that little boat. Just take a look. Now, here's Russia way over there, St.